Okay, just looking at the time, we're at 4:05. We might make a start. So thank you to everybody that's joined promptly. By way of introductions, my name is Peter Major. I'm the Head of Service Delivery at Pledge Consulting. I would like to welcome you formally to the webinar this afternoon. A number of my Pledge Consulting colleagues are on the webinar as well as some familiar names from outside of the organisation and some new names as well. So it's great to see everybody here and thank you again for joining. What I'd like to go through today is the subject of adaptive assurance. We've spent a little bit of time looking at different ways to do assurance in a more efficient way, and we think we've got a compelling way of bringing together a number of components. We use the word adaptive in a very specific way in this webinar. So adaptive really means a way of bringing together both Agile and Waterfall components of delivery in terms of a right-sized assurance approach that is right-sized for initiatives at hand. I've got about 15 slides to go through. I think that'll take probably 30 to 40 minutes. If there are any questions along the way, please raise your hand in the meeting. We've got Louise Gardner, Managing Director of Pledge Consulting, moderating the discussion. And please feel free to put questions in the chat. So without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, just checking that a PowerPoint slide has appeared in presentation mode in everybody's screens. Great. So without any further ado, let's get into the materials. In terms of the flow of the webinar today, I'd like to start by setting a little bit of context around assurance practices and delivery practices. Then let's get into a definition of adaptive assurance to support delivery practices, and then how adaptive assurance is different to other types of insurance. We'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits of doing an adaptive assurance approach, and then to talk through an adaptive assurance model. We want to explain that model in terms of our typical approach to assurance, and then present elements of a case study that tries to bring the model to life. And then obviously some contact information at the end. All right, so let's start with the delivery context. So in our observation, most organisations select the best parts of Waterfall and Agile models in their delivery environment. So we define this selective balance as a multimodal or hybrid model, and that term would be familiar to most of you. Historically, delivery models have been based on pure Waterfall concepts, and obviously in recent decades, we've moved more to Agile. There are advantages and disadvantages of different models, and we generally suggest that there is no one right answer, and that's probably one of the reasons why a hybrid approach has evolved in recent times. As a result of the increasing influences of Agile practices, there are elements of both formal and informal agility. And when we talk formal agility, we're talking about some of the Agile specific models, things like SAFe, Scrum, and so on. And some of the small A Agile things are more around your behaviours. You know, how do you collaborate appropriately? How do you make decisions at speed, and so on. So what I also wanted to explain here in terms of the definition of multimodal is it really can mean a number of different things in each environment's context. So it could mean that there's a waterfall pathway by which certain types of projects are done, and then an Agile pathway by which other projects are done. It could mean elements of Agile practices in certain phases or stages of an overall delivery model. It could also mean some of that small Agile thinking permeating the delivery model alongside some of the big A thinking. So there's a whole range of ways that that can actually be positioned. So Waterfall, most people will be familiar with the generic stages of a waterfall model, and then we've got an Agile model as well. And that diagram on the right obviously represents some of the iterative elements of Agile. So let's now talk about some client challenges in the delivery context. We would argue that executives are generally less concerned about which delivery model is in place and more just concerned about delivery succeeding. So that's a great principle to hold to, but then how do we actually assess delivery success in a consistent way and in a standard way? So what we're trying to do is help executives understand that delivery is on track for success, almost regardless of which delivery model is in place. Another challenge is that having a common assurance model that spans maybe some of these small agile elements to support delivery success and maybe some of the big A agile elements as well is probably subjective. We haven't seen a lot of formal assurance models that cover some of those types of activities. They seem to often be wrapped up in things like retros, or even more actively in your daily stand-ups when you're working in an agile way. But then how do you compare your retrospective and how do you have a format for your retrospective that's consistent to some of the other things that you're doing in your delivery environment? So next slide here, I just wanted to throw up some samples of elements of a hybrid model or an adaptive delivery model. So this model here, just move the display a little bit. This is intended to represent a certain type of project within a client organization, denoted by column B there, where we've got level 3. Obviously, we can infer from that that budget is a key determinant in the level or approach to delivery. And then what has been prescribed here are some of the outputs and artifacts associated with that delivery for a particular stage gate or across stage gates. And interrogating that list, we can see some things that are familiar through the Waterfall lens, things like project status reports, things like benefits management plan, but also some things that are very agile specific, like backlogs, like retrospectives. So it's interesting that in this particular instance, there's some formal waterfall artifacts and some formal agile artifacts. Just putting some of the labels on that diagram there. Now, what's interesting is that PMBOK in its most recent version has come up with this concept of performance domains. And there are these 8 performance domains that are listed in the diagram there, and it's quite possible to overlay the performance domains against some of these artifacts. And what that's really saying is that there are a number of artifacts that have different focuses, as you would expect, as we go through project delivery. Some are about the actual product outputs, and some of them are about managing the work. So we're going to come back to the performance domains concept in a couple of slides. The next slide I wanted to bring up is some sample hybrid artifacts. So this is coming down a level from your overall delivery model. And firstly, I've got status report artifacts. Now, the point here is that the top left quadrant is a typical waterfall project status report. It includes, for those with microscopes, things like scope and schedule and budget. And underneath that, you have an agile project status report. Now, you can actually have, depending on your delivery model, some elements reported through your agile project status report and some through your traditional or waterfall project status report. So we've seen examples of that actually in play. Over on the right-hand side, we've got firstly an example of a lean canvas. Now, the point here is that lean canvas is a very agile type concept. But if you think about it, a lot of waterfall projects actually do lean canvases. It's often called something a little bit different. It might be a project initiation document or a project brief or something like that, which then gets turned into something more formal and specific and granular, often in a business case. So there is a little bit of overlap there. The final example to show here is sprint planning. So obviously, sprint planning, a lot of us are familiar with the concept there, but this is hinged to a particular project environment that has a project manager and has a start date and end date. So, according to, depending what religion of Agile you belong to, there are no project managers, or project managers are scrum masters, or sort of something in between. So again, it's a bit of a mishmash. So let's go now to a definition of adaptive assurance. We've coined the term adaptive assurance as a way of assessing the definition, application, and effectiveness of a multimodal or hybrid governance and delivery model. Quite a mouthful there, but hopefully people have followed the trail from the earlier slides. So we define adaptive assurance as the assessment of the underlying governance and delivery components according to the multimodal model within which they are delivered, and the presentation of that assessment in a consistent way. So shorthand, think how to assure in a hybrid environment, and by implication, how to right size your assurance for the different components in your hybrid environment. So what does that mean? The waterfall components of your delivery are assessed according to perhaps more traditional waterfall models and definitions of quality for waterfall outputs. And the Agile components are similarly assessed against what one would expect from an Agile perspective. But we try to bring those two components together into a consistent framework. Now, this type of assurance can also assess the suitability of the selected hybrid model or elements within the hybrid model, and also the clarity of definition and understanding of the particular model for the initiative at hand. So what does that mean? It may be accepted based on a series of parameters in a delivery environment that a project starts waterfall, finishes waterfall, but the design, develop, build, test is done iteratively. So it may well be that the concept of iteration doesn't make sense for a particular project, just despite the machine spitting out that it is permitted to do so at the start of the initiative. So, and there are a number of ways where you can assess how your underlying components are, whether they are working effectively, and whether they are working consistently with the other components that may come from a different background. So what we're really trying to do here is ensure that the delivery approach is aligned with the level of risk and the level of complexity of the project or program being delivered. So you may well ask, how is this different to other types of assurance? We believe this is a unique assurance proposition for the following reasons. We'll put together a table and we'll explore this row by row. So firstly, many organisations still might rely on a workshop format, and it might even be a single workshop, even interestingly for a large initiative, and that is labelled the PIR. Now, that can certainly be sufficient assurance for certain types of initiatives. What we observe is that with single workshop formats, there tends to be a focus on the neutral to positive outcomes, and they can be a little bit of a pat on the back exercise, and either we've succeeded or we've got through it without really necessarily addressing some of the elements in the room. And if those elements aren't acknowledged or understood reasonably, then it's not as easy for the organisation to learn from that experience in terms of it not being captured and therefore applied to other initiatives in the environment. Another type of assurance may just be a pure desktop review or an audit of documents and outputs. And we do certainly see more of that associated with particular stage gates. So that could, for example, be an audit of a business case, an audit of a project management plan, and so on. Now, that also has its place, but what's missing there is the nuance of the interview or the discussion about, well, yeah, I know this is what the document says, but what's not really captured in here is A, B, and C, or some of the consistency of the view about the health of a project or the key risks across your stakeholder cohort. So that can be one of the limitations of a pure desktop review. The adaptive assurance approach, which is an extension of our preferred assurance approach, is assurance of both content and of approach through a desktop review and an assessment of stakeholders' perspective. And then the third component of that is the stakeholders' understanding of the approach, as in, do we understand what components are waterfall and which parts are agile? Do we feel as though they're fit for purpose for the initiative at hand, and so on. The next row, in terms of the other types of assurance, can be a strict binary application of industry definitions and knowledge areas. And at its, well, the example that comes to mind certainly for me is something like a P3M3 assessment from the Axelos suite, which is basically, unless you've done this and this and this, then you have a certain score associated with your rating, and there may be perception that the score is a suboptimal one. So what we're trying to do to assuage that risk or that concern is have a delivery approach that sits on the continuum between waterfall and agile and accepts that each environment is unique. It will have its own waterfall elements. It will have its own agile elements. It will have its own common elements. And it may also have other things that influence your review, like your level of delivery risk or your comfort with accepting higher levels of risk. The final row we've got here is around assessing agile principles within the hybrid model. Back to the allusion at the start of the webinar, sometimes that can be very subjective, and there are certainly agile environments that rely less or not enough, I should say, on documentation of retrospectives or some of the other activities that are undertaken, in which case the assessment of the maturity, the assessment of your status will feel a lot more subjective. And what we're trying to do is to get away from that. We also want to assess holistically the initiative through the lens of delivery success. Let's talk a little bit now about some of the benefits of adaptive assurance. We believe hybrid is the new normal, but everyone's hybrid is unique. The irony is not lost. A lot of organisations appear to have wanted to move to a purer form of Agile, and by that I mean certainly the capital A Agile in terms of SAFe and Scrum implementations and so on. But there certainly seems to be a little bit of a swing back away from that, and kind of acknowledging that even to go pure Agile, despite best intentions, it doesn't necessarily work always in the corporate world. The next reason for considering adaptive assurance is, how do you know that your hybrid, whatever its definition is working as well as it should be? It's an interesting question to ponder. So what does this model provide? It's a more repeatable and a more responsive approach to assurance. It can be undertaken at any point in delivery and apply any relevant domains or delivery practices. Sorry, there's two relevance there. The format is standard or intended to be standard across all initiative sizes, complexities, and risk profiles, supporting wider analysis and insights. And in summary, it provides a tailored, flexible, scalable, and comprehensive approach to governance and delivery assurance. And to reiterate some of the points from before, what that could mean at one end of the spectrum, it could be as simple as a workshop with a PIR label on it for something that's relatively low risk and simple, complemented by review of selected artifacts. And obviously at the other end of the scale, there could be assurance by stage gates focusing on particular elements that apply there. Combination of subjective, i.e. stakeholder feedback, as well as desktop review, analysis, and identifying themes from there. So let's have a look at the model, and I promised we'd come back to those performance domains. So here they are repeated, the 8 PMBOK performance domains. So these are common classifications across Waterfall, Agile, and hybrid models. And some of you may be aware of the recent thinking from the authors of PMBOK, or the managers of PMBOK, in this area. So it's sort of acknowledging that Agile is real and it's here to stay, and it's trying to incorporate that into, I guess, the older thinking of PMBOK. Now, where a project is run entirely Waterfall or Agile, the performance domains provide a consistent classification model for the assurance insights. And also, and importantly, where it's run under that multimodal or hybrid model, the relevant components are assessed individually and then assessed holistically for the initiative across the performance domain. So the further slide will provide some further detail about the mapping of the underlying elements to the assurance model. And I'll take a little bit of time to talk through this one and allow people to contemplate it. So on the left-hand side, I've got the listing of the performance domains again from PMBOK. The next two columns across are, let's call them old school definitions, also reference back to an earlier version of PMBOK in version 6 in that third column there. Excuse me. And I'm guessing everybody on the call will be familiar with a lot of those labels, whether or not they're the way things are labelled in your organisation or not. Moving across to the right, we've got rational unified processes. Now, rational unified processes tend to be applied a lot more in an IT space. And looking at the labels there, at least to me, there's a bit of a step across to some of the Agile language, but it still certainly has reference back to some of those traditional labels as well. So I wanted to include that just from an IT perspective. And then over on the right-hand side, we've got relevant Agile definitions and practices. And that's intended to be a sample there rather than a prescriptive list. Again, acknowledging that there's many flavors of Agile. Some of them are very prescribed and industry standard, and some of those tend to be an amalgam as well. So how do we use something like this? If we're wanting to do an assessment or an assurance of a particular initiative at a point in time where the delivery performance domain is important, for example. So the delivery domain seems to focus on quality and benefits management. What are the elements that we need to review for that? Well, from a PMBOK process area perspective, it would be about the initial definition of quality, the ongoing control of benefits as change requests are reviewed and approved, moving across to your Agile thinking. It can be around your iteration demos, which is a proof of agreement that the functionality for this particular sprint is as intended, feature acceptance, and ongoing value management. So I'll just leave that on the screen for half a minute for people to take a look at. Once again, please feel free to post any questions in the chat or comments. So let's continue on. This is a subset of a particular stage gate process. Working left to right, we start with gate 2, at least in this diagram, across to gate 6. And we have a number of gates obviously associated with that progression and a subset of the artifacts associated with those gates. And those artifacts requiring to be examined to get through each gate. Now, if we think about overlaying those performance domains on this checkpoint diagram, that might look. Now, this isn't intended to be absolutely perfect, but it's really intended to prompt your thinking about, in terms of your existing delivery models, where do the PMBOK performance domains apply? Something like stakeholder, one would reasonably expect to apply across all of your stage gates because stakeholder management is fundamentally important. The planning performance domain is an example of maybe where it applies in your early phases, certainly in preparation for producing a business case or something that results in funding being allocated. So not necessarily something that applies to all of the gates. So what this is trying to represent really is that it's not a blanket across all performance domains at all points in your delivery approach. There might be some areas where certain performance domains can be emphasised more or less. So let's step now through our assurance approach. And we've relabeled this our adaptive assurance approach because we think a lot of the principles are exactly the same. So we start with artifact reviews and interviews. What that typically provides is an understanding of the level of consistency between the artifacts and the stakeholder verbal feedback. And it also provides an assessment of activities and behaviours across Waterfall, Agile and hybrid models. So obviously, depending on the type of assurance, in terms of the timing of the assurance through your life cycle, the type of assurance that's required for the initiative at hand, whether it's a $100,000 project all the way up to a $10 million project, you'll have a different sense of the rigour that's applied to that assessment. Moving on from there is a distillation of some initial themes that have been identified across those performance domains. Typically, they might be presented, if not discussed, with some key stakeholders or key customers associated with the review to validate or potentially to sharpen the focus further. The next stage we have here is some detailed recommendations, which would be recommendations by performance domains, and also include a documentation of delivery model understanding and application. And finally, of course, because we want to be action oriented, we capture recommendations, priorities, and recommended owners for the actions, and align those priorities to delivery timing models and cadences. So obviously, if a project is in a troubled state, there might be high urgency around remediating some key items, or if the assurance is timed prior to a business case submission and funding approval, then there may be some urgency around that too. So let's now look at, I guess, a summary view of what an adaptive assurance report might look like. Once again, we have the performance domains listed in the first column. And working across from there, we might have an overall RAG rating for the performance domain. Obviously, if a particular domain is not applicable at a point in time, that can be marked as an NA rather than as a colour. We might have an Agile delivery rating against the performance domains as distinct from a Waterfall delivery rating for that performance domain. And that's really attempting to cover where there may be Agile artifacts and behaviours and activities that are running in parallel to some Waterfall activities and artifacts for the same project at the same time. There's also an option here to provide a governance rating, because sometimes we find that governance is an important enough subject in its own right. And especially where we're talking about Agile versus Waterfall, the governance can feel very, very different. So yeah, sometimes it helps to call out governance separately. And then, of course, to the right, some key findings and some key recommendations. Those colours in here are nominal. However, I will say in the next sample case study, they are not nominal. Okay, so let's look at a case study. So the context here is a cross-faculty project in the education sector, different views of requirements and priorities between faculties, and also multiple sponsors, each representing different perspectives on those requirements and priorities and definitions of success. A solution was developed according to a loose vendor-led definition of sprints. And what that means is there was an attempt to document the requirements at an appropriate point in time. Because of pressure from different perspectives, the number of requirements and priorities of requirements changed, which had a knock-on impact to the sprints. So that's the meaning behind the word loose there with intent. The final point of the context is that the delivery model supporting robust increments against outcomes and benefits was not really well defined. There was certainly a delivery model available, but it appeared as though elements of that delivery model were selectively chosen for convenience, perhaps. So this is a summary assessment of that particular initiative at conclusion, with some key findings to the right-hand side there. And when you take the time to have a look at those key findings against the context, well, it presents quite a stark picture. Now, obviously, we've taken the recommendations out for sensitivity's sake. So what does this say at a glance? Like, obviously, there's a lot of red. There are glimpses of green, but certainly the overall theme of that assessment is in the amber to red end of the spectrum. And we would generally suggest where any component is red, then the overall assessment for the initiative is red. And that was certainly the case here. So compare and contrast that view to some of the text-based outcomes that I include on the next slide. At completion, the project took 3 times longer to complete than originally intended and delivered half of a required solution. Project was retrospectively repositioned as a discovery rather than as a project. And in terms of organisational outcomes associated with that experience, recognition of the need for clearer governance and delivery models. So understanding that the IT solution was delivered agile, business solution delivered in discrete phases, but making sure that that was planned and executed efficiently. An understanding of the need for PMO visibility of all projects, including empowerment to challenge and pause delivery at stage gates. So obviously the implication there is that the PMO and others did have visibility about this being a challenged project, but there wasn't the governance around it to make sure that it was treated appropriately. Third organisational outcome is the understanding of the importance of active sponsorship and business ownership with the appropriate delegations based on the size and risk profile of the project at hand. So what that can mean is if it's within a particular sponsor's delegations and project delegations, there's no issue with a sponsor making a decision on a particular change request, all other things being equal. But obviously, as you move up the scale and where there might be cross portfolio impacts or other business impacts, then the importance of having transparency increases and might influence where a final decision can be made. So in summary, I'd suggest consideration of delivery within your portfolio objectively. Is delivery undertaken effectively? Is it delivering the right outcomes? And then thinking of the delivery models within your environment which are intended to achieve those. Are the delivery models clear? Are they followed? Are they effective? Are they fit for purpose? All of those things. And then looking at the assurance element of your portfolio. How is assurance defined in your delivery environment? Does it cover all initiative types? Does it cover both waterfall and agile principles individually, holistically, and perhaps along that sliding scale in between? Does it cover the effectiveness of the delivery models? And do people understand how the delivery models actually help enhance delivery success? So there's some things to think about. Please visit our website for further information, www.pledgeconsulting.com.au, and our phone number is attached in order to arrange a further discussion. Just by way of closing,
sorry, Peter, sorry to break in. We do have a question in the chat. Before you close out, do you want to go back to Margaret? Had a great question actually. If you can go back to the table that had the adaptive versus traditional about halfway through the pack.
Yeah,
I think it'd be good to get that up. Yeah, keep going.
That one?
Yeah. Margaret's question was, and Margaret, just please message in the chat if I don't get this right. Can you explain the PIR has a cross, however the ticked item refers to desktop. What does that mean? Sometimes the workshop model doesn't enable stakeholders to be completely honest in front of the audience, and if the workshop is being run by the project manager and stakeholders have an issue with the PM, they may not be forthcoming with their reviews. Oh, sorry, it's not that slide. Go back a bit more.
So this is the differentiator, this one.
Oh, that one. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Could you run through those words again, please?
I think what Margaret is asking is you've put that with other types of assurance, you wouldn't do a single stakeholder workshop. You'd do more of a collaborative approach to a workshop, but that's not always in the best interests of some of the people in the room. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That is certainly a chronic challenge with a workshop format. Yes, it could be the project manager. Sorry, I'll start that again. Maybe the culture of the project means that people aren't willing to share some of the concerns that they've held, and they might be associated with the project manager or some of the key stakeholders there. And we would generally encourage, where possible, some sort of independent assurance, or at least an independently facilitated workshop, rather than having the team mark their own homework. Was there another part to the question?
Yeah, no, Margaret was just typing. She said, so sure. So when you say, she's still typing, well, are you going to each desktop? I'm not sure I understand the question, Margaret. Yeah, you do them individually where appropriate. Is that what that's the point, Pete, I guess?
Individual workshops where appropriate, or individual interviews where appropriate.
Yeah, individual interviews where appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. We find that is generally the case anyway with the senior stakeholders that maybe have a few years of scars and political experience and prefer to speak more candidly individually rather than in front of colleagues or in front of the team. Now, of course, that might beg the question of what do you write in the assurance report? Well, we would generally not name individuals in terms of their views or their feedback. We would not provide quotes or be able to identify any individuals or roles associated with particular findings or observations.
Yeah, Margaret's follow-up comment is, wow, that would take quite a while. I think what's important to kind of note there is, you know, the individual interviews are time boxed, and they would only be done with the people who needed, or it was felt by leadership or by us as independents that it was required. And the more collaborative workshop style is more efficient and would be preferred where appropriate, but it's just not always appropriate to get to the right answer.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we often end up with is a combination of a handful of one-on-one interviews, which may be time boxed even to half an hour. There may also be workshops with, tends to be people that work in the same team that have a level of trust and rapport and are willing to bounce ideas off each other, rather than necessarily people that all think the same thing. So that could, for example, be a development team that's provided services on a project, or the change management team, or the business looking at the project from the perspective of requirements and quality, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Were there any other items in the chat there, Louise?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment. Maybe if you do the kind of 3 closeout slides, it will give people a couple of minutes to think if they have any final questions, and then if there isn't, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, no problems. Okay, so thanks for your patience there. Just wanted to go through some upcoming pledge events that you might be interested in. We have a very popular Practical AI for PMO and project professionals session coming up on the 30th of April there. The feedback on earlier sessions this year has been fantastic, so I really encourage people to consider attending that one if AI feels like it's more important personally and professionally. Secondly, we have our 6th PMO Leadership Symposium, the Melbourne-based symposium, on the 15th of May, and the theme there is Strategy to Execution, the Future of PMO, sponsored by Rego Consulting. Thirdly, we have our Project Management Technology Showcase with a number of sponsors confirmed there. That's a 2-day event in July on the 30th and 31st. And that's at the UTS in Sydney. So if you're not already aware of those, they're certainly worth investigating, may be suitable for you or for those in your team. And they're very successful and very profound events. So I look forward to seeing everybody there. Back over to you, Louise. In terms of the chat or the questions?
No, we just got some thank yous. So yeah, thank you, Peter. I think we can wrap it up.
Okay, fantastic. Have a great rest of the week, everyone, and we'll talk again soon.